Ciao friends! In this Unplugged video, I want to share how I can try to solve a business problem using both DAX and some data modeling technique. So let's describe the problem I face, and in order to do that, I want to show the definition of the problem here in this sentence. I want to display the distribution of the distance between purchases made by the same customer. What does it mean? I prepared a small example in Excel so that we can see what I mean with that definition. Uh, each customer has a transaction, sales transaction, and the customer can make purchases over time, right? So we have this customer A, made a transaction on the 1st of January, 3rd, 6th, 7th, 11th of January, and this is what the customer B made over time, and so on. So if we list all the transactions made by a customer, we want to know the distance in days between the current transaction and the previous transaction. So this means that this transaction happened 2 days after the previous one, this one 3 days after the previous one, and so on. And if we look at this distance, we can group the transactions that have the same distance. And we want to create this other table where we say, okay, how many events have 1 day of distance between the previous event? And so if I color this in yellow, for example, you see that this is the yellow one. And how many events we have? Only one. How many events happened 2 days after the previous transaction? And again, I can use this other color, and we have 2, and this is the other. How many events we made after 3 days? And we can use another color just to clarify what I'm doing, and this is what we have. So we had only one event 1 and 2 days after the previous event, and 3 events 3 days after the previous event. And finally, we have 2 events here. We use another color here with this distance, 4 days. Okay, so we have 2 events 4 days after. What I want to do with this table, I want to display this chart. So the ultimate goal of this analysis is to create this chart, of course, in Power BI. I don't want to use Excel for a simple reason. I have many transactions in my model, and I want to display this in Power BI. So if I go back to Power BI to see my model, I discover that I don't have the information I want to display. I have something different. I have a customer table connected to a sales table. We can ignore date and product at the moment. If we focus just on sales and customer, I not only have a sales table connected to customer, but I might have multiple transactions for the same date made by the same customer. And in that case, if I look at the Excel file, I want to ignore them. I want to consider only one event for every day where a customer made 1 or more transactions, right? So I want to ignore, in other words, I want to ignore transactions made the same day. This is something I want to ignore. And I want to ignore the first transaction made by a customer overall. So this is the first transaction of the customer A for my company. I want to ignore it. So if you think about the problem, it's not a problem that we can solve with just a measure. I mean, we can try to solve the problem with a measure, but it is very complex, and it is not the way I will try to solve the problem, because the problem is complex, and I want to split the problem in several smaller issues, and I want to create the calculation required. And at the end, once I have a clear idea of what I need to do, I will try to implement this as a measure. One important consideration is also the following. If we look at the chart I want to create, you see that in the x-axis, I need just numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And if I look at the model here, I don't have this information. So I will certainly need a column or a table with these numbers, because otherwise I will not be able to create my calculation. So this is something to keep in mind to solve the problem. So the way I face this issue, I start using DAX Studio. I open DAX Studio and I try to create in DAX Studio the same steps I shown you in Excel. And I connected Duck Studio to my model. I have here the customer. I have here my window, and I will focus mainly on the result here. So the first thing I want to do is I want to create these steps, right? So what can I do? First of all, I need to create this. But before creating this, I had to create this, right? So customer and date. Now, customer and date are two information I have in the sales table. If you think about that, I have in the sales table is here. We can take a look here. We have in the sales table, we have the customer key, which identifies the customer, and the order date. These are the only two columns I actually need from this table. So let's try to write a summarize where I get the customer key and I get the order date. Here we go. So I start this one this way, and I already have an issue. Or yes, because summarize requires the name of the table at the beginning. I could have used summarize columns. I don't want to use summarize columns because potentially I could put this definition in a measure, and in a measure I will not be able to use summarize columns. So let's try this way, and I have this visualization. So we have for each customer key the order date. How many transactions the customer made in each date? I don't really care. So we can ignore that part. Now, the second step, and let's say that this is my step one. So this is actually the way I use this. So I create a variable, step one is equal to this one. So I know that this is a first step. I have the table. This is like a virtual table that has what I need. Now, the second step is, and let me move at the bottom so we can see the code better. The second step is I want to know the distance. So I need to add a column to compute the distance between the current row and the previous row. Now, the problem is that I could, if I write this code, return step one, and I sort the data order by customer key, and let's try to copy this because otherwise it takes too much time. If I do this, actually, I have this visualization that already tells me that there is something that is not so good in this data set because I have, you see that the customer key that has the same date is not very, it doesn't happen very often. So just for the purpose of this demo, maybe that we switch the analysis from the customer to, I don't know, the city or the country, because otherwise it's the distribution of the data I have for this example is not good. So let's try to use here, instead of says customer key, let's use the customer city. And of course, I have to use the same. So I'm just changing a little bit the requirements, but the logic is pretty much the same. And I need to see something like that. I need to see several dates for the same city. Seems good enough. It seems good enough, but let's try to see whether the country will be better, because I don't have the perfect data set for doing this demo. And here we have Australia, we have 1 days or other days. Looks much better because you see that we don't always have, I mean, if it was too dense, we would have had always 1 day, but we actually have different numbers. So it could work. I think it could work. We have a small number of customers, which in this case country, but it should be good. Okay, so let's try to use this one. Now, I use the order by, but the order by is not something that I can rely on to get the previous row. So in Excel, this will be simple. I just want to get the previous row and I want to compute the difference. But this is not something I can do easily in DAX. So let's try. At the moment, I don't focus too much on the optimization. I just want to get a number that works. So let's try to create another step, step 2. Where I want to do this. So let's say that I want to add a column, add columns to the step 1. And the column I want to add, let's try to get more space here. The column I want to add should have a distance or days. Let's call this days. Yes, why not? Days, maybe with the add symbol because this is a calculated column. And here, okay, let's do this. Before days, let's start with something simpler. Previous date, right? We want to compute the previous date of a transaction made by customers of the same country. So how can I do that? Well, something I could do. So step one is the list of all the transactions for all the countries. I could just say, I want to get from the step one table, I want to get the maximum value from step one for sales order date. Let me clarify what I mean with this. Clearly, I cannot, I mean, if I write this, I get the last date for step one, you know, for all the transactions. But if I apply a filter here, I can say, I want to filter step one where the countries should be the same and the order date should be less than or equal to the current row, which means that because I need the current row in step one and I iterate step one again, I have two nested row context. It's a good idea if I store in a variable or two the current, so let's say current date, current, let's say country is equal to the customer country. Here we go. And the other variable is the current date, which is equal to the sales order date. We do this, and then we return the maximum value for this filter where we create here. So let's just see if I can do this. I can write this better. Let's say that I can create a subset here, which is previous transaction. And previous transactions is another variable, previous transactions, where I have the filter I was writing, right? So the filter of step one is, I want to filter the countries, customer country has to be the same. So this has to be equal to this one. I cannot use calculate to do this analysis because I'm using a temporary table I have in memory. So I don't have a data lineage to do that. And I do the same here. So the sales order date, which is the column I have here in the step one table, has to be less than, not less than or equal to, but less than the current date. Current date. Now I have to I have to format the code as soon as possible because I start to not understand what I'm writing. But if this is correct, so this should be possible. It should be possible to format this code. It works. So we have the summarize here. We have the add columns. For the previous date, we compute a list of the previous transactions in step one, and we look in this previous transaction. We look for the last order date available. Okay, so now if I show here step two and I run this code, it could take a while because this code is not very optimized. But if I did this well, I can see here that in the previous date, I have exactly the previous, the value of the order date in the previous row. So I solved the first problem. So give me the value of the previous row. I know that if I have to optimize something in my calculation, it's probably this is the part where I have to do some optimization. But at the moment, this is not my priority. I just want to solve the problem. So let's move forward. So now that I have the previous date, and by the way, I can transform this into a variable. So let's just to get more space for the visualization so we can use a better font. Okay, should be good. So this is another variable for me. So this is the previous date. So previous date. You see that I'm using the underscore just because I want to avoid the conflict with any name of function or table. And now the different days is equal to, I want to get the integer value that I obtain from the difference between the current date minus the previous date. So if we have one, it should be the day before, and then I return days. Okay, so let's see if this works. So I format the code and missing the equal. Format the code again. Okay, the code is formatted now. So this is what I'm trying to do now. This is no longer previous day. This is just days, and I run the code. Let's see what happens here. Here we go. Oh, we have to solve this problem when we have a blank, because if we didn't find anything here. So if previous date is a blank, I don't want to do this calculation. So let's say if because you see this big number is because we're comparing with blank that is 0. But if it is a blank, I don't want to do the calculation at all. So if I have a blank of the previous date, then I want to, okay, if I not have a blank, I want to do this calculation. Otherwise, I don't want to do anything. So let's see if the calculation works. So this is, let me just format this with the short line. So it's a little bit better. Okay, so this is my if statement. And if I execute the code now, I should expect here a blank, which is exactly what I wanted. Okay, so now I have the first step of the problem. So I obtain this table. At the moment, this is just a table I have in a table expression index, but this is a good starting point. Now I have to solve this second problem. I have to group by this column. So the column days, the column distance is what I want to use to group by, and I want to count how many rows I have in the table with that number. So I can do this. So step 2 is my table here. So let's go and let's write a step 3 because I want to get another table. One thing we could try to do, and I think it will not work, but let's try, is using summarize, because I could say, okay, I want to summarize step 2 by using days, right? Days. And then I want to count how many rows I have. So rows is equal to count rows of what? Of a table I don't have. This is a problem because I want to count how many rows I have in the table step 2 that have the same number of days. I know for sure that this will not be possible. If I try, you will see, if I try to write count rows of step 2, this is going to fail, or at least doesn't produce the right number. Let's see the result here in step 3. And of course, once I have step 3, I have to comment this other part. Let's go in comment. And okay, so because I have different columns here. And this is not working. Why? Because step 2 is a temporary table. It doesn't have a data lineage, and summarize will work only with the data lineage. So it's not going to work. So in these cases, when you cannot obtain a result with summarize, we use the slower version, group by, that can work in this condition. If I use group by, I can do pretty much the same, but here I cannot use count rows. I have to use a current group function using SumX of current group, comma 1. I mean, I could use if, okay, let's try to see if it works. And couple of seconds, and actually we have the number obtained here. So it seems working. But okay, that's fine. I would have liked to write this, but the problem is that I don't know why, but you see, this syntax is not allowed. There is an error. I have to use current group. If I try to use count text of current group, comma 1, maybe this is easier to understand. But actually writing count text and then writing an expression, you have to write an expression that is not blank. Or you could do this. Oh, by the way, we have to ignore the blank too. That's another good point. So what if I use here days? So let's see. Because I want to get rid of this line. So if I use this function, because otherwise I have to write a filter and I have to exclude the blank. Yeah, I have to exclude the blank the same. So, but it's better if we do the blank. at the end. I don't know. I mean, performance-wise, it would be probably the same. So depending on what you prefer, to be honest, this context could be, more complex. So this is a simpler syntax to me because I know that I want to count one for each row that I have in the current group that is the group of rows that have the same number in this column days. Now, problem is that I have this blank. I don't like it. I want to ignore it. So let's say that I have another step 4, that is equal to filter of step 3, where I want this to be not is blank of days. I think I can use this. I could have used rows too, but okay, that's fine. No, step days is better. And here I write step 4. So let's see what happens now. And I should see that I no longer have 4 here. It could be a good idea to do an order by this time by the column days. Ascending should be good. So we should already see something like a distribution of the data across the days, which is exactly what I wanted to do, right? I wanted to obtain this column, this bar chart or column chart that I will display later. So far so good. I have this number of days. Thinking. That seems good. It seems good. Problem is that this table can be used in a dynamic way. Yes, the way I wrote it, yes, but now I have to display the result of this, right? So how can I do that? Let's try to do a simple, easy approach. Could be the following. I simply get the entire calculation beside evaluate, and I copy this evaluation here in a calculated table. Okay, maybe it's not what you want to do at the beginning, but it's a good place to start. So if I write a table here, let's call this table distribution equal to, and I paste this code. Order by, of course, order by is not part of the calculation, and I create this table here. Takes a couple of seconds, but this table is computed. Of course, this is not dynamic. I have the data only stored in this table here. We can see this here. So we see the number of days and the amount of rows for each day, which means that now I can already solve my problem, part of the problem, which is I can go here, I can use this column chart, and I can include days in the axis here and rows in the legend, in the values, right? Yeah. Okay, so something start displaying data, but we have to figure out whether this is what we want. So there are a couple of issues here. One is that the number we see in the x-axis, you see it goes until the last day available. Now, we could use a filter here. So we could apply a filter over days and show me only the first 20 days. So less than 20. And I apply the filter. Makes sense. I mean, this could work. You see that this is the first one, the second, the third. But maybe that we don't like the idea that only a few numbers are visible. So, for example, if I go here and I sort this column by in an ascending way, you can see that here we have missing numbers. We have 50, 52, 4, 6, 9, 60. You see, we are missing 51, 53, 55. And depending on the visualization, this could be a good idea or not. Moreover, this works because I obtained the column, but if I want to move this into a measure and I want to create something completely dynamic, even though it would be slower, I know that I have to do something better. So probably is a good idea to create another table here. Let's go here, generate table here. And this table could be just a list of numbers. So days is equal to select columns. So let me just enlarge this a little bit so you can read. Generate series. from, let's say 1 to, I only needed the first 300 numbers with step 1. Oops, keyboard. Step 1, and but I don't want, I use select columns because I want to customize the name of the column, because otherwise it will be called value, and I don't like it. So here we go. Now this is my days table that I can connect with a relationship to the distribution table here, for example. And so now I could use this. Now I don't like this because this should be days to distribution should be one to many. Why that? Because from my point of view, this is a one-to-many relationship. I know that I only have one value here, but the idea is that I'm doing this because I want to show all the values I have in day, and I need a blank row in case there are days that are above 300. So this is what I want, right? And here, this is my relationship. And I mean, in this particular example, nothing changes, but this is the way I will create the model in this case. So, I mean, it works, but what is the problem of this approach? What if I create here a slicer, or yeah, I can get here from the product table, brand. I want to see the brand. Come on, there are too many things here. So let's see if I can get rid of this. I can copy the brand here, and I use this brand as a slicer, and I increase the font, and let's see if I can make it more visible. Let's say it was 20. Here we go. Okay, so let's reduce this so we have more real estate for the slicer and everything else. So let's get rid of this one too. I don't need this description anymore, so we have more space here. I can put the slicer on this slide here, and I can put my chart here. Okay, so the problem I'm facing now is that if I use this technique using a calculate table, this is not responding to my selection. So I should transform everything I wrote into a measure. Okay, so let's try to go back to Power BI, because what I want to do is that this should be a measure, which means that this entire calculation works, but what I should do as a measure, I cannot return a table. So step 4 is a table. What I could do is, now that I have a days table in the model, I could assume that depending on the selection I made on days, I want to sum the value I have in rows only for the rows that are included in the filter context in the days table. What does it mean? Well, the content of step 4 is displayed here. The selection, let me write this. So if I write current days selection is equal to values of days. Oh yeah, I have to refresh this probably. No, I have this here. So days day, this one. So days day is the column that contains one day or multiple days if I selected a range of dates. And I want to filter only those rows here where days is within this list. So I can write another filter, step 5, where I filter step 4, where days, the column days, is within current day selection. Remember, I'm not worrying about the performance now. I just want to see if I'm able to obtain the result I want, and then I will worry about the performance. Maybe not today. Okay, so now that I have this smaller list of rows, so imagine that I have only 2 and 3 selected. This filter will return only 2 rows. So the final step result for my measure will be sum x of step 5 and rows, which is the column that has the number of rows. Usually I should have only 1 row, but you never know. And then finally return result. Okay, so this will be my measure. Let's call this D. I don't know how to call this measure, to be honest, but let's move forward. So D is equal to this. I'm doing this just because I want to use format query here. And yes, of course, the the equal to, this is the syntax for the measure in DAX. Okay. So now I get everything after the assignment here, and I go back to, actually, I can get also the D equal to, I go back to Power BI, and I create a measure. So I go here, new measure, and I paste the code I wrote before. So now I go here, I said new measure, please. Oh, it's so fun when you have the editor working well. Okay, let's try again. So I go in sales and I create a new measure. I finally have my editor here for the measure, and I can create my measure this way. Okay, so now I have my measure. What can I do with this measure? The idea is that with this measure D, is a very bad name, but I'm not good at name today. So let's create a new page. And in this new page, I put the number of days here. So I want to create a chart where I have the number of days here. Let's create the chart here. I'll remove the filter, visualization. It's always too, come on. Okay. I want to use a column chart. So day will be my axis and D is my values. And now we see that, oh, I mean, it's much better than what I was worried about, because actually I got an answer. I got a result in a couple of seconds probably. So the result is here, but the advantage, the good thing here is that if I create the filter by brand, so I create this brand here as a slicer, and let's just increase the size of the font, and let's use 20. So, oops, 20. So when I click on a datum, I expect this to change. And when I click on Contoso, this changes again. Wow, it is working. Of course, I should spend more time looking at the correctness of the result. I'm not doing that now. And of course, that would be a completely different Unplugged to see how to optimize this measure. But again, remember that the slow part of this measure is probably the initial step here, because this calculation is particularly heavy, and probably we can find better ways to optimize this calculation. So I hope you enjoyed this Unplugged video. As I said, this is an example of how the important thing is not the solution by itself, but the way I try to approach the problem. I try to split the problem in smaller problems, initially just using tables in DAX Studio. And then when I want to translate this into a measure, I simply use these temporary tables in variables as something dynamically created in the measure, knowing that it could be an issue for the performance. But again, if the performance is good enough, you don't have to worry too much about that. Otherwise, that would be the topic for another Unplugged, how to optimize the measure I just created today. Thank you and enjoy DAX.